So in order to try out the logger service from the front end, we of course need to add a route or handler or something like that to the broker microservice. And of course, ultimately, every one of our microservices will be able to communicate directly with the logger microservice without going through the broker, but we want to try things out. So let's go over to our broker service and look at our routes file. So right now we have this mux post handle. And of course, this is what we're using to handle every submission from the front end. So let's look at that handler. At the top here, we have our request payload, which has an action of type string, and then it has auth as an auth payload. And of course, we also want to include another type. So let's create a type called log payload. And it's just a struct, and it only has two fields. Name, which is a string, and in JSON, I'll call that name. And then it has data, so we'll just duplicate that and call this one data. And in JSON, we'll call it data. And now, let's add that type as a possible entry, and we'll call this log of type log payload. And in JSON, we'll call that log, and we'll omit it when it's empty. Okay, so we have that. Now, back down here in handle submission, of course, we only have one case we're handling right now, auth. So let's add another case. We'll call this one case log. And that will go to a function that doesn't exist yet called app.logItem. And we'll hand it the response writer, and we'll also hand it the request payload. And this time we're going to pass .log. Okay, so let's go down here now and create that function logItem. So func receiver app pointer to type config, and this has to be called logItem. And it takes two parameters, w, which is of type http.responseWriter, and we'll call the second one entry of type logEntry or log payload. And the logic here is pretty much the same as authenticate. We're going to get our data, JSON data, and error, which we're ignoring, and you probably shouldn't, but I'm going to. And we'll call JSON.Marshall indent. And again, in production, I wouldn't use Marshall indent, I would use Marshall, but this makes things readable during development. And we're going to take entry with no prefix, and we'll indent everything with one tab. That gives you my data. Now, what URL are we going to call? Well, I'll put it in here as its own variable just to make it readable. Log service URL is assigned the value of, we're going to go to HTTP, and we use the same name we did in our Docker Compose, which is logger-service, and we want to go to /log. Okay, so that's the URL we're going to call. Now we'll build a request, and potentially an error come from http.newRequest, and we're going to use type post because that's what the log service expects to find. We're going to post to log service URL, and we're going to post JSON data, but we need to turn it into a bytes.newBuffer. And we put in JSON data. And we check for an error. If error is not equal to nil, then we'll call app.errorJSON, and we'll give that W and the error, and we'll return. Otherwise, let's set the header in our request, request.header.set, and we're going to set it to content-type and application/JSON. So we've got our header set. Now let's create an HTTP client. Client is assigned the type of a reference to, try that again, http.client. And we get a response and potentially an error when we call client.do with our request. And we'll again check for an error, so I'll copy this logic and paste it in here. And I'll defer closing the body, which I might not have to, but I'm going to anyway. Defer response.body.close and give ourselves some room. And if we get back the correct response, status accepted, then we're good. Otherwise, we're not. So if response.statuscode is not equal to http.statusAccepted, then we'll throw back an error. So I'll copy this, paste it in there. Otherwise, we're good. So let's prepare a response, var payload of type JSON response. And we'll say payload.error is equal to false, and payload.message is equal to just logged. That's enough for our purposes. And we write that out. We'll just say app.writeJSON, and that requires w http.statusAccepted, and our data is payload. And that should be enough if we did everything right, which we'll find out before too long. But now we have the Logger service running in Docker. When we do our make up build, we'll have the updated broker service running in Docker. So now we just need to go modify our front end to make a call to the broker saying log this information and give things a try. All right, let's move on.